every human is unique. I am an amalgamation of all of my identities and life experiences. All of that I'm bringing to work, right? Sometimes the culture or the norms or the expectations or what it means to be successful, the pathway is so narrow that I struggle so hard to be someone else to fit in that I can't fully be myself and I'm not showing up confident. If I'm not confident being myself, I'm not going to raise my hand. I'm not going to take that stretch assignment. I'm not going to suggest something because I'm afraid of standing out.
Welcome back to Talent Hunters, powered by MRI Network, where each week we talk with the world's top talent strategists and executive recruiters. If you want to build talented teams that drive your company to big goals and big growth, then this podcast is for you. And now, let's join the conversation with today's episode of Talent Hunters.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Vince Holt, host of Talent Hunters. Today we have Beth Ridley, founder and CEO of the Ridley Consulting Group located in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Beth is an organizational transformation consultant, speaker, as well as an author. Beth combines 25 plus years of executive leadership and management consulting experience with expertise in diversity and inclusion and positive psychology to help CEOs achieve thriving workplace cultures. Welcome, Beth.
Thank you for having me. Very nice to meet you.
So looking forward to this conversation. It's the first time that I've ever delved into this, and I'm hoping that you can educate me as well as our audience in areas that we might not be familiar with.
And you're just in the process.
Well, to start this out, why don't you tell us just a little bit about your background and really what has led you to where you are today in your career journey?
Well, kind of an interesting path. I like to say I've been working in this space around workplace culture, inclusion, and belonging for as long as I've been working, let's just say about 30 years, but in very sort of non-traditional ways. So the first half of my working career, about 12 years, I lived all overseas. And that was just because I just always being from Wisconsin, I always felt like there's got to be a better party going on somewhere in the world. And I was determined to find out where. So my goal was just to work overseas. And it almost didn't matter the job or the industry. So I did everything from teaching English in Japan. I worked for a bank in Thailand. I worked in the telecommunications sector in South Africa. And I lived for about 2 years in each of those places, a few other international places. So I've always had jobs where I was part of a multicultural team or leading multicultural teams. So this whole idea of diversity for me, it's so broad, right? I think in the US, we tend to think of the basics, age, race, gender, but overseas, it's relationship to authority or comfort with silence, how people view time. What does it mean to be on time? Are things that I thought were so fascinating. So diversity in the broadest sense of the word is something that I was just always oriented around. Then when I came back to the United States, most of my work was spent working for a really large management consulting firm based out of New York City. And they would pay us companies would pay us big bucks to come in and develop these strategies. But then they didn't care about the culture with which how people came together to execute those strategies. And I could always tell 5 minutes in a room with the team if they're going to be successful with the strategy or not. Because no strategy is perfect, but it's how you come together to execute it. And if you had a cohesive culture of inclusion and belonging, those teams were successful with the strategies. But if you didn't, if people didn't feel comfortable speaking up or it was always yes to the most senior person in the room and allowed a group think, they were not going to be successful. And it always puzzled me, how come people don't invest in culture and how the team comes together as much as they invest in the strategy on paper? So when I finally, became a senior leader in my corporate job, when I moved here to Milwaukee for family reasons, that was always top of mind. I'm going to put culture first and everything else will sort of take care of itself. And I really brought in a lot of the learnings about how to bridge across differences that we take for granted because we don't see those differences was really the secret sauce to creating a great, thriving team where people could be successful. And then it was something that I did well. And other leaders would be like, how are you always getting high engagement scores? How are you always bringing this diverse group of people together and coalescing? And I thought, well, if you're asking little old me, I should just hang my shingle and become a consultant. And so that's what I did. I've been doing this for 6 years now.
So let's dig into this. Organizational culture. Why do you believe that it's critical to success? And in your breaking this down, please define what you mean by culture.
So by culture, I mean the norms and sort of the guiding principles and the expectations of how people treat one another at work. It's really more about the how the work gets done, not what gets done. And I think the what gets done is easier to measure. It looks more like a tangible outcome. So we tend to focus on that. And when times get tough and we're under stress, we emphasize the what gets done and we sort of neglect the how. But the how is where you get, again, the higher engagement. If people feel good about being at the place they work, they're going to dig deep. They're going to, if they have the, and to me, I'll just also define what a good culture is. A good culture will have what I call the 4 C's. So one is people just feel comfortable being who they are. That's really more like the psychological safety. I feel secure in being able to speak up and show up just with who I am. That has to be foundational, right? Otherwise, I'm not concentrating on work. I'm too worried about fitting in. The second C is connection. I feel like my work has meaning. It's not just a series of tasks. And I have a genuine good feeling, positive relationships with others. Not to say that we're never going to have conflict, not to say that people are going to be my BFFs, but a genuine sense of respect. The third C is contribution. People care that I show up at work. They ask me what I think. They lean into my expertise. They care about my ideas. They ask. And then the fourth C is the people who are setting the tone for the culture, the leaders. It's important to them. And employees can tell if the how we work together is not important to the leader, it's not going to be important to me because I'm busy and I got other stuff to do. And that's where you get bad behavior. You get what I call toxic rock stars. They get the work done, but man, working with them is just demoralizing. You get turnover. I'm going to retreat to my shell. I'm not going to extend myself because who cares? And by the way, I'm too afraid to speak up. So yeah, you're asking me how the project's going. It's on time. It's in budget, and it's not. And so you never get the truth. And then you make really bad decisions, and suboptimal decisions lead to suboptimal outcomes. So I hope that answered your question, like how I define a thriving workplace culture and why the how is just as important as the what, and how it's so easy to neglect the how because, the what is the shiny thing and the how is, it's just something that we're not used to paying attention to.
So thank you, because your definition in your example of culture is success in everything imaginable. Sports, business, doesn't make any difference. You've got to have the culture. Where does diversity and inclusion fit into that picture?
Ooh, good question. Those are pillars. Those are pillars of a great culture. So if I were to wrap up those 4 C's, to me, the outcome of all of that is people feel a sense of belonging. And belonging speaks to the fundamental human need that we all have for connection and acceptance. On the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, belonging is right there with love and is the foundation for self-worth and self-esteem, right? If we don't feel good about ourselves, we're not going to be good contributors to the workforce or the team or whatever, right? So I have to feel confident and secure, and so belonging is a pillar of that. Diversity and inclusion are the supports for belonging. Diversity means just appreciating that every human is unique. I am an amalgamation of all of my identities and life experiences, right? So, uh, a 20 something, I'm kidding, I'm not 20 something, but let's just say like a Gen X, I'm really Gen X, a Gen X woman, grew up in the Midwest, African American, world traveler, um, you know, lover of seafood, like all of that, seasonal allergies, all of that I'm bringing to work, right? Um, and sometimes the culture or the norms or the expectations or what it means to be successful, the pathway is so narrow that I struggle so hard to be someone else to fit in that I can't fully be myself and I'm not showing up confident. If I'm not confident being myself, I'm not going to raise my hand. I'm not going to take that stretch assignment. I'm not going to suggest something because I'm afraid of standing out. When we can broaden that, what those differences that are acknowledged, recognized, not as something to just tolerate, but actually maybe there's something there that you're bringing in a different perspective. You're bringing in new ideas that only I can have. That's where that inclusion piece comes in, right? So are we looking to not just tolerate what makes each of us unique, but create more of the opportunity for those differences to really be our strongest asset? And a lot of it honestly just comes down to those differences really only matter at work in the sense that I'm bringing in a new skill set, I'm bringing in new expertise, I'm bringing in new ideas and perspectives. And when we can look at our challenges and opportunities from multiple lenses, we're just more thoughtful in our approach. We plant more little seeds of innovation because the biggest killer of innovation is groupthink. And we're more prone to groupthink if we're forcing people who are already different to always be the same. When I can feel that I'm valued and appreciated for what makes me unique, and of course, there's a balance to that, right? And we can get into that if you want to. When I say bring your authentic self to work, I don't mean like completely, but we can talk about like what that balance is. But sometimes the workforce, it's so freaking narrow that we lose. I'll give you just an example to make it more challengeable. In one of the companies I worked for, most of the senior leaders had a legal background. And so, everything, emails were so long and everything had to be like documented. And I came from a more creative background and I felt sort of stifled and I was too embarrassed to share some of my ideas. And one of the points where this company didn't excel is that customers hated their communications because they were all written by lawyers. And it was the lens through which was comfortable and familiar with lawyers. They snuffed out anyone who didn't have a legal background. They didn't even bring that perspective. Over time, after getting so many bad reviews from their customers about, we don't want your mail anymore, they started to elevate different perspectives into the organization. So that's just like one example, a really simple example of how diversity, we have to appreciate that it exists and it's a good thing, especially when it can be channeled in an inclusive way towards our common goal. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, as you were describing this, and again, I apologize to my ignorance, but it almost sounds like this is not racially motivated, or you're talking natural business when you're talking about diversity and inclusion. What I'm hearing you say is we have two parties, say leadership, employees, they both have to equally approach each other on a level ground as far as leadership knows what they have to get done, but they have to have an open mind. That's just basic sports. It's basic companies. It's basic leadership. You have to have an open mind to be able to succeed. But some of that burden, if I'm hearing you correctly, equally amount, I guess, relies on the people that are coming to that leadership because they've got to give as much as leadership is giving. Am I hearing you right?
Yeah, exactly. So to me, this inclusion, this belonging, this great culture of how we work together in a way that we appreciate different perspectives because none of us knows everything. I need other ideas. That mutual respect, it is a two-way street. And that's where I think, everyone has to contribute, right? So to me, that's where the flexibility comes in. In order for you to feel that sense of inclusion and belonging, I have to be curious about, well, what do you think? And then when you tell me something, I'm like, that's ridiculous. I don't say that's ridiculous. I say, I'm trying to understand. I don't agree with you. And disagreement is wonderful. I don't agree with you, but I understand what you're trying to say. And maybe there's a both and in what we're trying to do as opposed to an either or. I think leaders have to really understand the employee perspective and get out of their leadership bubble and, engage with the employees. A client that I have recently appointed a new CEO. For the whole first year, that CEO was just doing listening sessions, wanting to understand the employees. Again, that speaks to the contribution. People want to know that you care about them. I work so hard every day. Do you even care? At the same time, employees have to appreciate the leadership perspective, the breadth of perspectives that they have to keep in mind, the long-term view. A lot of employees show up and they just care about what's going on Friday. But you have to then get out of your own employee view, or maybe you've got a narrow focus, and appreciate the leader is looking at everybody's concerns over a long term. And I have to be able to respect that even if I don't, like it. I have to be able to understand. So that, to me, that bridging across any difference, and that difference could be hierarchy, it could be level, it could be role, it could be tenure, it could be age, it could be race, it could be gender. I mean, there's no limitation to what might be getting in the way of us surely extending that mutual respect and understanding. But to do that, there has to be three things. One, just self-awareness of the way I look at the world is just my way. It's awesome, but it's not the only way. And that allows me to be humble enough to know, you know what, maybe there's another idea out there. And if I'm humble enough to appreciate that, I'm okay asking, well, what do you think? Tell me more. And then when I hear something that's not my idea, that's not my values, not my beliefs, not my understanding, not my background, I don't dismiss it, but I say, I'm going to, my goal is to understand, not to agree with you, but to understand, because if I can understand you, I win. I'm smarter. I'm more thoughtful. I've expanded my viewpoint and now I'm a leader, so to me, the ability to do that is leadership. Because as you become a leader, you're not the one doing the work. So you're already disconnected from that. And you're leading so many people. You have to be able to bridge across those differences to be a thoughtful leader, an intelligent leader, to make smart decisions. So to me, inclusivity is leadership.
Did you grow up in Wisconsin?
I did.
Okay, so you may not have had as many hurdles to get over that you discussed earlier that somebody in the South or something like that has had to get over, but you still overcame a lot of bumps in the road. You had walls that you were probably raised knowing that you could be faced with. Beth, I want you to open up your kimono, and I really want you to, what made your drive all over the world? What made your drive get you to where you are today? Because you touched on what you've done, okay? But you possess something inside. Maybe it was mom and dad. Maybe it was the way you were raised. But there's something there that was driving you. And there's thousands and thousands of people that I think would like to harness that inner drive that you've got. What can they do to get that?
Oh, that's a really good question. I guess I'll sort of answer like what drives me first before I suggest for other people. I don't really know what it is. I sort of jokingly said Wisconsin. It's kind of like a low key place. And I honestly always did feel like there was a better party somewhere, and I was in search of it. So that was my like a very superficial motivation for traveling the world. But I think it's just innate curiosity. I am so curious of what maybe my husband calls it nosy. So okay, I'm nosy. Um, but I'm more nosy than so I'll put it like this. My first time to Japan was right out of college. I spoke zero Japanese. I never had met a person from Japan. And I will have to say, I was really afraid that the Japanese people were kind of racist, right? I mean, that was just sort of my interpretation. And I was terrified to go to Japan, but I was more curious and nosy than I was terrified. So I was like, I'm going. And that's how I felt for every country that I went to. South Africa, it was right after the end of apartheid. I was petrified. Thailand, the same thing. I speak, whatever. But the curiosity was more. And every time I went, I was amazed at how wonderful the people were, at how my assumptions were just that. They were just gross oversimplifications, base rooted in very little fact and knowledge, and how much more rich my world has been because I have a deep understanding of all these different places. So I think when I moved back to the United States, started a family, I could not travel. I mean, it just wasn't practical. But what then my next best thing was, I can explore the diversity of cultures that are right here in my department, because every human is a window into another world. And I truly believe that. And I feel like this work around inclusion and belonging allows us to all be world travelers through the life experiences of other people. So I think that's my own personal motivation. That sounds good. It doesn't really translate into like something that people would hire me to do. So I always try to bring it back to the business imperative, which is business requires us to get the best out of people, minimize burnout, which is huge at work, make better decisions. So there's a business imperative for this. And also the other imperative is, honest to God, Americans, we work really hard. We are the hardest working humans on the planet. I can definitely say that, having lived in a lot of other places. We prioritize productivity. We work super hard. We spend so much of our time at work. I want the workplace to be a place where it fills us up with positivity and good vibes, then depletes us because we spend too much time at work. And this work around really valuing people, getting to know people beneath the surface, it just builds stronger relationships, positive relationships. And the research shows positive relationships with others is the number one source of joy in life. We certainly can point to that in our personal life, and the workplace is no exception because we work with people. Sometimes I work with my colleagues more than I see my own children. So for me, it was both those, the business imperative, but also we deserve, if we're spending so much time at work, to make it a joyful place.
Well, your drive, I don't think you give yourself enough credit because, yeah, you're traveling all over the world. You overcame fears of the travel. I understand leaving Wisconsin to seeing the rest of the world that, oh my gosh, what an adventure. I agree with you. Going to Japan, spent a vacation in Japan, only about 10 days. And ignorance really showed from my part, from the standpoint of getting there, because I got off the tour bus and decided I wanted to go to a pearl factory. Well, mistake number one was my ignorance showed, you think there's more than one pearl factory? So I'm in the middle of downtown Tokyo, literally, And those people, mistake number 2, don't speak English. So how do I get back to the hotel? It felt like I was on an amazing race. And so finally, I got smart enough to show the cab driver my hotel key, and he got me back to the hotel.
Oh, smart.
Yeah, that's a nice way to end it. The reality was the ignorance going into it. So your adventure story of going to different parts of the world and so forth, the people that you're teaching need to understand the curiosity, the want, the desire that you had, whether you're talking to leadership or you're talking to employees or whoever. They've got to want like you want it.
Yeah.
And I think there's a bigger problem out there from the standpoint, you touched on it, employers have a way of doing their business, and a lot of people don't have an open mind to ideas. But I also think on the flip side of it, you've got a lot of people coming into it as employees that want a job.
Mm-hmm.
They got to pay the bills.
Yeah.
And that's first and foremost.
Yeah.
And so those are the ones that I think, regardless of race or anything else, I think your ambitions touch more than just what you've talked about as far as inclusion and diversity, because I'm just listening to you and the energy. You open up doors with your smile.
No,
You literally open up doors with your smile.
that's so kind.
And your personal care for success, regardless if it's yours or the person you're talking to, is imperative. I think that's the education, in my mind, that you truly bring to the party without realizing it.
Oh, well,
Don't label it. Because I don't think where you're going as a label, and please forgive me for voicing my opinion on this, I am so impressed with what you're bringing, the energy, the drive, the passion, the smile. If you could teach leadership and teach employees or wannabe employees, right? That, there is no limit to where we could go. What are your thoughts on that?
Wow. I would like to do an interview with you every day. Because, it's a hard road. I would say, well, I'll put it like this. All right. So I started my business 6 years ago, and I would say the burning platform for focusing on culture was burnout. And so this was before COVID. And so it was like, burnout's the new epidemic. And, people were starting to pay attention to burnout, and then COVID. And that, I think, really made culture not a nice to do thing when we have the time and money, which is hardly ever for most companies, to an absolute imperative. Because, people were afraid. We were all navigating through this together, and no one really knew what they were doing. And I will tell you, from a leadership standpoint, employees at that point remembered how you made them feel less than what you did, right? No leader was getting it right or perfect because we just didn't know. But employees remembered how you made them feel. Did you ask how they were doing? If someone in their family had COVID, did you inquire about that? Did you acknowledge their fear? Did you let them know, I don't know exactly what's going on? And did you create that sense of trust? I had a lot of clients at that point. I thought for sure all my clients are going to be like, we've got bigger fish to fry. I can't, no time for this COVID stuff. No time for this culture stuff. Almost all of them said, we need this now more than ever. It's become a very apparent. So I do think coming out of COVID, spending money on culture and time is a little bit more mainstream. Interestingly enough, we're coming back now to burnout. And now I don't know in your world if you're hearing a lot about the rise of loneliness is now the new epidemic at work. Loneliness, the void, the void of meaningful relationships. A lot of what I've been talking about. We feel disconnected. Overall well-being at work kind of sucks. Well-being for people, kind of sucks. And so employees are now realizing it's costing them money because you don't show up for work for two reasons. You're physically sick or you're emotionally not there. Either way, it's disengagement or absenteeism. When people go on short-term disability for stress and anxiety, it costs money. And so I think now it's just another reason why to focus on culture. So I think people are coming along, but unfortunately, I think it requires some type of big burning platform for a lot of companies to be more proactive, reactive, right? To put a Band-Aid on, whether that be the pandemic, people taking disability leave because of stress and anxiety. Now I think we should focus on culture. Hopefully, and I try to position culture as leadership. Like that's your number one job as a leader, to create the environment for people to thrive. I'm trying to get people to be less reactive and more proactive and just build it in with the expectation. Then you don't need these big time costly initiatives. If the expectation of leaders is, yeah, you have your to-do list, but only you, leader, only you is setting the tone. You're as a team leader, your job is to create the environment for other people to thrive. Like literally, if you're not doing that, you're a project manager, right? And I've had to tell some clients, your senior leadership team is a team of project managers because no one is prioritizing culture. You're too worried about getting your work done. You are a project manager. So call yourselves project manager team. And then they get mad at me. But they didn't fire me because they know I'm telling them the truth. And that's the role of an outside consultant. I can tell you what you need to hear because I don't have to stick around for the backlash around that, right? But that's the honest to God truth. I'm telling people, this is what leadership looks like in 2024 and beyond. Otherwise, stop calling yourself that and be a proud project manager.
It's interesting because you brought up COVID. Probably worldwide, globally, COVID destroyed what we know as culture. Because in surviving COVID, people had to regenerate their way of doing business. And frankly speaking, and I'm appealing to leadership at this point, they don't know. I mean, there's some segments of business that do, but most businesses don't know how to work with the three levels of remote, hybrid. They know how to deal with in office, okay? But that transition has disrupted everything you just talked about because you're appealing to leadership to head up this culture. My thought and experience has been I've had to re-understand business. I'm a boomer, okay? Everything is about accountability and it's about moving forward. But today's leaders have a bigger challenge because they're having to relearn how to do business.
Yeah.
And I think you're bringing something of very, very value of building a culture when you can touch and feel everybody, right? Is the way it was through all my growing up. It's transitioning now to something totally different. And I kind of played with it with you a little bit at the very beginning. Glad to virtually meet you. Are we meeting virtually?
Yeah.
Because the reality is today, I'm not going to say the majority, but I'm a big 49, 51% person, okay? 51% of the business world is like this.
Yeah, fair.
Didn't used to be that way.
Yeah.
And so having somebody like you consulting with your past experience and so forth, so diversified, okay? in Japan, Africa, all over the world, to bring in ideas of being able to, quote unquote, communicate with each other.
Yeah.
Because that's the key that you've just described.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. None of this gets bridged without the ability to communicate. And again, not to argue your point and win the argument, but to try to understand the other point of view, because we just have to be somewhat flexible. And you raised actually two good points talking about what happened to culture after COVID. The one good thing that did happen, it taught us that we can be more flexible than we give ourselves credit for. A lot of times we think there's like, one size fits all, and that's going to be the best because it covers most people and it's most efficient. COVID did teach us that we have the ability to be more flexible. And now we have had to embrace hybrid work teams. And that's one way that we can be flexible. But then you also talked about like even generational expectations. So now that things have calmed down a little bit, I do notice with my clients, and I do a lot of workshops around bridging the generational divide around generational expectations at work, because these darn Gen Zers, and I've got 3 kids, I can tell you, I struggle with them. They have a very different outlook on work, and they bring it. And it can be frustrating, but it can also be super helpful. But I do notice that a lot of my clients who are in senior leadership roles, calling all the shots, who are either Bloomers or Gen Xers, are more comfortable in work. And so that is the mandate. They're basing that lens on what makes a great culture, how do we best collaborate, through my life experience and what's comfortable and familiar to me. And then obviously your younger generations, aren't always happy about that. So it really is sort of, not really mediation. I don't really do the back and forth. I just give them the mindset and the skill set to, again, recognize the way you see something is unique to you. How do you ask and be curious to better understand a different viewpoint? And then when you understand the different viewpoint, it's okay to not agree. But instead of these binary decisions, you're in the office or you're not. I feel like we always default to binary. It's either yes or no, right or wrong. Like, can you just play around with the both and maybe we can't find a solution, but it's worth exploring. And again, usually we can find the opportunity to be more flexible than we give ourselves credit for.
Totally agree with that. Beth, I really want to thank you so much for taking your time here. I mean, I approached this conversation from a standpoint of ignorance. It took me in a total different direction of better communication.
Might I just say, replace the word ignorance with humility, right? Humility. Acknowledging that there might be something you don't know. To me, that's humility, and that's leadership.
Good advice. Good advice. I thank you for that. So everything we've talked about, there's people going to watch this. How do they get in contact with you?
www.ridleyconsultants.com. Ridley Consultants, plural.com is my website. But if you want to just get your hands on some really practical resources on how you can be more inclusive in your approach at work, just Google Ridley Resources. And I have a whole suite of complimentary free downloadables. So ridleyconsultants.com or Ridley Resources will take you straight to the good stuff.
Thank you so much, Beth, for everything you've shared with her. You've opened my eyes to a lot.
Right.
And I look forward to following Ridley Resources.
Yes, please do. Thank you.